In December of 1999, Sega released a new game titled Shenmue for their, at the time, new console, the Sega Dreamcast. In Shenmue, you play as protagonist Ryu Hazuki, who's trying to track down and get revenge on the murder of his father. The gameplay is pretty straightforward. Essentially, to progress the story, you have to talk to various NPCs in a somewhat small but very detailed and lively overworld. It is, for its time, an impressive game with full voice acting, lots of objects and characters to interact with, and a fairly solid story. And, fun fact, Shenmue also has been credited with coining and popularizing the term QuickTime events, and was one of the earliest games to make somewhat extensive use of them. Kind of like Heavy Rain, if the story actually made sense. Shenmue even received a sequel just 2 years later in 2001 with Shenmue II, which was actually developed alongside the first game. In fact, there was also a third game planned, but we'll come back to that later. Shenmue II continues the story of Shenmue and has also received similar critical acclaim. While Shenmue II was still released on the Dreamcast in Japan and Europe, things were a bit different for North America. You see, 2001 was one of Sega's worst years financially, with the company losing up to $350 million that year due to the Dreamcast being a massive failure and selling less than 10 million units, causing Sega to lose the console war at the time. This also led to the discontinuation of the Dreamcast early that same year, and Microsoft acquiring the rights to exclusively publish Shenmue 2 on the Xbox, their own new and first home console. You can most likely already see where this is going, so I will just get right to the point. Shenmue 2 obviously did not sell very well. It managed to sell about 470,000 copies in total across all platforms, which may sound like a big number at first, but you have to consider that for a game to really be considered successful, it has to sell well enough to at least cover its development costs. In fact, not even Shenmue 1, which sold some 1.18 million copies, was reportedly able to make enough money to do so. Together, Shenmue 1 and 2 are said to have cost around $70 million to develop, a figure which was later corrected to be $47 million instead by the series creator Yu Suzuki. It is obvious that the first Shenmue game probably would have sold even better if it wasn't for the Dreamcast being the massive failure it was. As for Shenmue 2, well, if you ask me, the main issue here was that there probably wasn't a big overlap of people who owned both a Dreamcast and an Xbox, so the people that had an Xbox most likely never got to play the first game or even heard of it, and vice versa, most people who owned a Dreamcast probably didn't have an Xbox and couldn't play the second game either. Now, as you can already guess, Shenmue 2 didn't receive another sequel because of this, and the third game of the Shenmue series, which I mentioned earlier, didn't come to be, essentially rendering the franchise dead, at least for the time being, but let's not get ahead of ourselves here. I think we all know what a dead video game franchise is, and we probably all know that one franchise that we wish had never died, but how and why do video game franchises die in the first place? Well, in the case of Shenmue and Shenmue 2, it was because they were essentially commercial failures. A commercial failure is, as already mentioned, when a game, or actually any kind of product for that matter, doesn't sell well enough to cover the costs required to develop and market it, or it just generally doesn't reach certain sales expectations. Of course, Shenmue isn't the only game or game franchise that got discontinued because of something like this. In fact, it isn't even Sega's only franchise that went on to die on the Xbox. Two other very notable examples would be Jet Set Radio, a game where you have to attack different environments with graffiti while evading authorities on roller skates, with its sequel Jet Set Radio Future, and also Panzer Dragoon, a series of dragon-themed rail shooters, with Panzer Dragoon Auto. That technically was a remake of the first Panzer Dragoon game in 2020, but we're going to ignore that for now. Sega has even more old and fairly iconic franchises they abandoned over the years, including Golden Axe, Crazy Taxi, and Echo the Dolphin, which all died because of various reasons. Golden Axe started out as an arcade game in 1989 that got later ported to the Sega Genesis and received multiple sequels. Ultimately, it didn't really stand the test of time though, and eventually died because of increasingly decreasing sales and generally poor receptions. Crazy Taxi suffered a similar fate and over time has been brushed off by Sega as an IP that they just used to make cheap mobile games, like they made Crazy Taxi City Rush in 2014 and Crazy Taxi Tycoon in 2017, which are both not available for download anymore, by the way. As for Echo the Dolphin, the series itself seemed to do pretty average overall, not too good but also not too bad, and seeing that Sega abandoned the series around the same time as the decline of the Dreamcast in 2000, I think it's fair to say that the reason for this might have been to focus on developing other games which would promise better sales. And while we're already talking about abandoning a franchise in favor of developing another franchise, let me introduce you to Killzone. Killzone was a series of first-person shooters developed by Guerrilla Games and published by Sony in the years between 2004 and 2013. The games sold really well, with all the main titles selling at least 1 million copies each, and even most of the spin-offs selling up to 900,000 copies respectively. Killzone did very well in many regards in 2013, and it seemed like it could only get better for the franchise. However, in 2011, Guerrilla Games already started working on a concept for a new IP, and by 2013, right after the release of the latest Killzone game, Killzone Shadowfall, the studio would focus their entire development power solely on developing their new game. What game am I talking about, you may ask? Well, it's none other than Horizon Zero Dawn. You might have heard of it. Needless to say, Horizon Zero Dawn turned out to be a massive success and ended up selling over 20 million copies since its release in 2017, way more than all Killzone games together have ever sold. So I think it's understandable that Guerrilla Games ended up focusing on developing sequels for the newer, more successful IP instead from that point onward, thus leaving Killzone behind. I mean, why settle for iron when you can have diamonds? That was a Minecraft reference. Another good example of this would be Infamous, developed by Sucker Punch Productions from 2009 to 2014. Infamous was a very successful series of action-adventure platformers that went on hiatus in 2014 after the release of Infamous First Light due to Sucker Punch focusing their work solely on the game Ghost of Tsushima, which released in 2020 and was also a very big success. But on another note, something else I've noticed is that some franchises die not necessarily due to poor sales or anything like that, quite the contrary actually. What am I talking about? Well, I'd like to call these gimmicky tech demo franchises. Essentially, franchises whose big selling point is, or was, that they show off or make extensive use of a very specific hardware gimmick or feature. Hided Wings is an excellent example of this in my opinion. The series was developed by Nintendo and consisted of 3 games in total. All 3 games were flight simulators and primarily showed off the various 3D capabilities and gimmicks of the consoles they were made for. The first Pilot Wings game, which was just titled Pilot Wings, got released on the Super Nintendo in Japan in 1990 and was made to showcase the console's fairly limited but for the time impressive 3D graphics, also known as Mode 7. What is Mode 7? Well, while the Super Nintendo was still a 2D console, Mode 7 was essentially a rendering mode for the console, which allowed for the scaling and rotating of sprites, thus creating a primitive but fairly effective 3D look for backgrounds and more. The second entry in the series was Pilot Wings 64, and I think the title of this game already kind of gives away what kind of game it was. It was a Nintendo 64 game, so I mean the 3D aspect is basically already in the title. With the N64 being Nintendo's first 3D console, it made sense to have some games at launch that would show off the console's capabilities, and of course, Pilot Wings 64 was one of those titles alongside Super Mario 64 and whatever this was. And lastly, we have Pilot Wings Resort, a 3DS launch title released in 2011 that more or less combined both Pilot Wings and Wii Sports Resort. The big gimmick of the 3DS was a stereoscopic 3D effect. You know, the kind that you get with 3D glasses, except you didn't need the glasses and instead you had to position your face in a very specific angle to your 3DS, and God forbid your face was too far away, too close to the screen. Anyways, Pilot Wings Resort was really intended to be a small title to show off that effect, and maybe also the slightly more powerful hardware that the 3DS had compared to the original DS. Other franchises that would fit this category would be Trauma Center, a series which was primarily on the DS and Wii, and thus heavily utilized touchscreen and motion controls. And then there's also Guitar Hero, which was massive during the 2000s, but started receiving less and less games once the 2010s started rolling around, with the last game being released in 2015. This is partially due to the games oversaturating the own market and not selling as well as they were expected to, but probably also due to the gameplay gimmick of having a guitar-shaped controller just losing popularity over the years. Of course, the controller part is more speculation on my end and doesn't have to be necessarily true. There are many more franchises out there which have died over time due to various reasons, which can range from a commercial failure to abandonment in favor of a different franchise to, in very rare cases, maybe even lack of new ideas by the developers, or simply a story being already told. Star Fox, Punch-Out, Tenchu, Sly Cooper, Jak and Daxter, Conquer, Banjo-Kazooie, F-Zero, Duke Nukem, Kid Icarus, lots of shovelware franchises, and heck, even goddamn Chibi Robo. As you can see, the list is nearly endless, and it will only get longer over time. A franchise dying, or rather going on hiatus, doesn't have to mean it will be gone forever though. Oh no. See, this is where we come back to Shenmue. In 2015, after many failed attempts to revive the series, Yu Suzuki, the creator of Shenmue, announced a Kickstarter campaign to fund the development of Shenmue III, which ended up raising over $7 million in total, way more than what was the initial goal of $2 million. As a result of this fundraising campaign, Shenmue III could finally be developed and was later released for PC and PlayStation in November of 2019, 18 years after the release of Shenmue II. Additionally, the first two Shenmue games were also ported to PC the year prior in 2018. Now, if Shenmue 3 was worth the long wait or not is up to interpretation, but if Shenmue has proven something, it is that even after almost 2 decades of a franchise being essentially dead, there's still a chance of it making a comeback somehow. Especially in recent years, we have seen many franchises be revived. Crash Bandicoot with the Insane trilogy and later games, Half-Life with Half-Life Alyx, Pikmin with Pikmin 4, even Doom with Doom 2016 if you count massive reboots of an old franchise to be a revival. Additionally, there are many franchises with highly anticipated sequels that are currently in the works, like Metroid Prime with Metroid Prime 4, a Perfect Dark reboot, a new Fable game, Beyond Good and Evil 2, and Payday 3. Even spiritual successes are a thing, with the recently released Bomb Rush Cyberpunk, for example, which is heavily inspired by and intended to be a successor to Jet Set Radio Future, with Hideki Naganuma, the lead composer of the original Jet Set Radio games, even contributing some music to the game. Or Yooka-Laylee, a spiritual successor to Banjo-Kazooie, developed by a team of developers that used to work on the original Banjo-Kazooie games. A lot of these franchises have very interesting stories behind how they died and sometimes even got revived, which I would love to cover in separate videos in the future maybe, but for the sake of this video I'm going to leave it at that. I just thought it would be interesting to take a brief look at a few franchises that have died over the years and explore some of the reasons behind the deaths of many franchises. At the end of the day, video games are something special, and it sucks to see a franchise you personally love die. Trust me, I know that feeling. Some franchises die way too early, some might even overstay their welcome. Some franchises might even get a sequel, but even if they don't, they'll at least live on through fan games, fan art, and in our hearts. What am I doing with my life, man?